All right. We're recording. We're here with Megan. How you doing today, Megan?
I'm good. Um, yeah, a little bit tired, but I'm good. But
Yeah.
you?
I am also a little bit tired, but I usually don't say that because I need the audience to know that I'm at 10 out of 10 peak performance at all times. This is going to be an exciting episode. I mean, look, I'll say that I think we briefly spoke about hallucinogenics. I think that sleep deprivation is a great way to open avenues of creativity and intuition that you wouldn't have access to if you were functioning with pristine sleep hygiene. So it's actually a superpower of mine. Many awesome articles that I've written have been written, in the middle of the night at very odd hours. So people like it. So this is just part of the package. Um, so you kind of have a couple of you have this article on psilocybin mushrooms, a tea recipe, which is kind of I won't read out the whole recipe, but people can go read it. But can you tell me a little bit about your experience with psychedelics and how that's impacted your life?
Okay. So I actually had no experience with psychedelics other than weed, if you count that, which I kind of maybe a little, I don't know, until 2020. And in 2020, it's kind of like a bit of a long story, but I basically had gotten like very sick. I was under a lot of stress. I had to take some antibiotics in like the end of 2017 that just like screwed up my stomach, and I was like losing weight. I like couldn't eat foods that I'd normally been able to eat. I was getting migraines all the time, which I've had a problem with since I was for as long as I can remember, basically, because I had a head injury when I was one. So chronic migraines have just been part of my life for as long as I can remember. Um, And in 2020, I just was kind of like losing it. It's like I was already like just really sick and struggling with my mental health. And then COVID hit, and it just became way, way worse. And, a friend like suggested I try mushrooms. It gave me some, and I took like a little bit and sort of immediately realized, like, oh my God, these can help me. So then I did something really reckless that I have to say, like, do not try this at home. Every person I've talked to who knows a lot about psychedelics, when I've told them this, has been like, what, are you crazy? I just started hero dosing basically my second time, which is taking more than 5 grams, um, which nobody thinks is a good idea. But I did that. I was just so convinced that they were going to heal me. And I kind of like went into this like semi-manic state where I was taking tons and tons of mushrooms while in lockdown. And around the same time, I met my now husband on OkCupid, and I convinced him to do a bunch of mushrooms with me too. Um, which the kind of plot twist there is he had a drug addiction that I didn't know about when we first started dating, but the mushrooms like healed it. So he hasn't used since our second date, because we were on these mushroom benders together. Uh, and when I came out of it, my stomach was healed. I haven't really gotten a migraine since. I think I've had one, and I was able to get rid of it pretty easily. Um, I had significantly better mental health, and I sort of had kind of broke. I've been kind of crediting the mushrooms for like breaking me out of the kind of like woke mind virus, but it's not entirely true. I think I was criticizing it before, and I was doing a lot of research and reading things that you're not really supposed to be reading, and listening to things you weren't supposed to be listening to if you're a pure woke or whatever. Um, but it kind of sped up that process. And the tea recipe I came up with, and this always will sound crazy to anyone who hasn't done mushrooms, and to anyone who has a lot of experience with plant psychedelics, they'll just be like, oh yeah, that happens. It was like the mushrooms told me what to put in the tea. So I just kind of winging, like putting together this tea recipe is like trying to make it mushrooms work better, basically. And they did seem to be working better, especially once I added the turmeric. Um, and then sort of afterwards, as you know, I was my husband, my now husband, and I were like coming out of this like mushroom fog, being like, "Whoa, we're like so much healthier than we were before," and we fell in love doing this. Um, I started like doing research to justify why I'd put those ingredients in the tea. So the article I wrote about it, where I like explained like this is why each ingredient does, was kind of like post hoc, where it was like I had the recipe and I was like, okay, so why does this work? Because I didn't actually know why any of those things would work before I put them in. Um, and So since then, I've done mushrooms fairly regularly, with the exception of the 2 pregnancies I've had, because I did not take mushrooms while pregnant. Um, and I've experimented a little bit with other psychedelics too. I've done ayahuasca 3 times, which is incredibly powerful. I cannot believe how much I threw up on those. But it just, yeah, it's hard to explain, honestly, psychedelics, but I really, really believe that they have like enormous healing potential for anything related to the brain gut. Um, and I mean, do you understand fractal geometry, kind of like the basic premise?
I'm familiar with fractals. Yeah.
Okay, so there's the kind of the as above, so below thing, where I started like thinking about it as um, our consciousness is made up. We're multi-organisms. We were made up of all these like gut bacteria, and stuff, and our microbiome makes up our consciousness. And in the same way, all the plants, all the animals, the humans, all the fungi, etc., on the earth kind of make up the consciousness of the earth. So it feels like mushrooms connect you both that level up, where you feel connected to the earth's consciousness is the best word I have, but it's obviously very different, I think, to how we experience consciousness, but it also connects you the level down to your gut microbiome. So one of the reasons mushrooms helped me so much is that I felt like I was in touch with my instincts in a way that I hadn't been before. So I went through this like stage after my first child was born, where I would do mushrooms and I would kind of go around the house and like see what revulsed me, and tried to like identify like what things were like toxic in my life based on like the mushroom instincts. So I would do mushrooms and then like I threw out all of our polyester clothing. I like stopped using tampons. I stopped using fluoride toothpaste, all because of like mushroom trips, where I was like, whoa, this isn't good for me. I need to stop and stop doing that. And I've just been significantly healthier since. So
I'm feeling really bad hearing this, not because anything you're saying is bad, but because I feel a little bit guilty. I haven't done psychedelics, and I don't necessarily. I think in general, I have a difficult time. I have a sense of myself that I need to man up, and I need to just take care. Medicine is for the weak, and I got to take care of myself.
this
Um,
medicine is for the weak. It's like it hits you hard.
I guess what I'm trying to say is that um, from very early on, I developed a prejudice against drug use because I mean, I developed it before having antidepressants thrust upon me at during puberty, but
Oh,
I, I had a commitment to rejecting drugs, and I know kids who got on ADHD medication or they got on antidepressants, SSRIs, and I think so I developed almost like an allergic reaction, and I would say that's part of an overall complex of rejecting drugs entirely. I don't regularly consume alcohol or caffeine or anything, which is kind of, I guess when you say, I woke up one day and I started throwing out the polyester. I've also tried to do that. So, I didn't actually take drugs in order to do that, but maybe that makes me crazier. I don't know who's crazier, but I was like, oh my gosh, the polyester, we got to get rid of this. So yeah, I guess I'm sympathetic. I feel like I self-assess as someone who is creative and who is health conscious, and we talked a little bit about this in the comments, and I sort of said I've been very resistant to people offering me marijuana. You list marijuana as something that would be part of your tea. That's something I am skeptical. I'm not skeptical of individual results of people saying marijuana has helped me. But I also know people for whom marijuana can activate underlying schizophrenic tendencies or anxiety tendencies or depressive tendencies or affect short-term memory. So I think these all affect people in different ways. And, everybody's got to weigh the risk and reward for themselves. But when I think of people in my life who struggle with a lot of the same issues that you describe, kind of, and maybe I'll deviate from things that you're talking about and just specifically say, I think that I've identified in a number of people who I really think are good people because they're caring people and they want to do the right thing. They're moral people. But I find often that people, that this sort of archetype that I'm describing, which is almost, in some ways I identify it as a kind of mother archetype, doesn't have to be exclusively for women either. I think men can also have this personality. But there's a tightness about everything. There's an inflexibility about everything. Everything has to be analytical in the rules, and if something bends the rules or breaks the rules, that breeziness, that casual exception of, well, it is what it is, and we're going to move on. There's a tightness and it's almost like an attachment disorder, not just to other human beings, but to concepts, to guilt, to past. And so as you're describing this unfolding journey of, the visualization I had in my head is there's this tightness, there's this constriction that the body is not free to heal itself. It's not free to relax and to redistribute energy from certain parts of the body to other parts. And we often talk about the brain as if it's like one thing, but the brain is very complex and has different parts. And so one part of your brain could be parasitic, your amygdala could be overactive, and it could be stealing energy from parts that need it, and they're not getting it. I mean, they're starved for oxygen and nutrients and sugar and all the things the brain needs, fats. And as a result, you've got atrophied parts of your brain that aren't allowed to express themselves. So I think it's very interesting. Again, I don't do caffeine, but take amphetamines in general as a class of drugs. They don't have calories. When people get super hyped up on amphetamines, it's not energy being introduced to the system. It's energy that already exists when the body being unlocked. It's the amphetamines triggering, the green light. It's go time. We're unleashing that inner potential, which you take it habitually all the time. You can form dependency issues and whatnot, or anhedonia. But the idea of taking somebody who feels that they're in a constricted mode, that they're kind of trapped in certain habitual cycles they can't break out of, and that being and you're not the first time I've heard success stories with this. So I think that it affects everybody differently. I would never say that any drug or any food or any substance is good for everyone or something. Everybody has allergies and whatnot. So I'm not a medical professional. I'm not a scientist, but just the pictures and the imagery that you were bringing up, it made me feel like, I don't feel the need to take psychedelics for myself at this point. And that's not to preclude whatever happens in the future. And I hope before I die I get to experience that. I'm very particular about time. Maybe that is my analytical side. I want to do it in the right way. Um, but I almost regret not having done it, because then I didn't have that tool in the toolbox to say, hey, look, I did this thing. It's not scary. And I want to share that with you because I think it can help you. Um, it's frustrating to me. Um, it's frustrating to me to think that there are people who, listening to your description and reading some of your writing about, where you were, where you've been, what you went through, where you are now. It just seems like, wow, imagine if you hadn't had that experience and the things that you unlocked remain kind of locked up and unable to go through what they needed to go through. They were unable to process physically or mentally or both. And it's like, I'm glad you found it when you did, but I don't know. There's a timing to everything, I'm sure, but I don't know. It makes me think about, you referenced some Native American culture and how in certain cultures, drug use or psychedelic use can be ritualized as part of rites of passage and maturity. And, I wonder, like in the same way that I guess in colleges, it's like you join a fraternity and you're expected to basically go through some kind of like enforced alcoholic period or so. You have to do that. And I've always kind of been like, yeah, that's probably not a good idea. What would our culture look like if we replaced that? And I don't want to use the term forced, but just said there's a stage of life where instead of going through a gallon of or a keg of alcohol or something, where you go through as a rite of passage, you go through a psychedelic experience. I think that has been more popular and unofficial through hippie culture since the 1960s. People are sort of informally doing that. But the problem with that I'm going to point out here and see what you think about this, is that I think a lot of the people who are attracted, maybe this isn't your individual case, but people who are attracted to psychedelics tend to already be open-minded people. And the people who need psychedelics the most are the most close-minded people, and therefore they're not going to do it. And so I think if we had some kind of cultural structure of authority where there were people in charge who said, you know what, we're going to create some social rules and social status and rituals around this substance, and therefore the people who are kind of strivers, they're kind of eager to satisfy, eager to please others, that's going to facilitate, kind of targeting this toward them. Whereas, the people who are loosey-goosey, they would have figured it out anyway. So it's kind of something I'm wondering about. Now, that's a tall order. How do you get to that? It's such the hippie movement itself, which is now transmutated into a million subcultures, is so idiosyncratic. So kind of like, I read Stanislav Grof, for example, and he was someone who really attempted to give the use of psychedelics a very professional, medical, psychological, well-researched justification, and wanted to make it something that was respected. But while he was doing his research, that's when the legal troubles came, and so he was fighting the government basically, and that I don't think that So I just wonder, alternative timeline, government doesn't intervene and instead says, we're actually going to fund this research, and we come to a place where we're kind of coming with meditation now, which like you talk to a doctor and they'll be like, yeah, meditation, there's proven health effects for that. Whereas at a certain point in the past, they would say, no, that's just a superstitious religious practice and doesn't have anything to it. So yeah, I guess the question is like, on an individual scale, you've seen the benefits for yourself. Maybe looking at a collective cultural scale, and you've written a little bit about your cynicism with politics. Do you feel, or do you see any kind of metacultural movements or things that you're participating in that give you hope for a more communal, ritualistic, or authoritative in a positive sense integration of drugs into our cultural life?
Well, I mean, something that kind of gives me hope with, a bunch of caveats is the fact that RFK Jr. was part of Trump's team. And as I'm sure everyone listening knows, Trump won the US election. I'm not a fan of Trump, but RFK Jr. psychedelics are on his radar as a tool for healing. So I think that if he's empowered to look into that, that could possibly have some benefits for the psychedelic movement. I agree with you that psychedelics are not for everyone. I didn't transfer this essay over onto my Substack because it's a bit dark, but on my personal website, I have a second essay about magic mushrooms called "Escaping the Psychosomatic Hell Spiral." And in that one, I actually talk more about what the trip entails and warn people that some people do have negative reactions to mushrooms. And one of the reasons for that, anecdotally and I guess logically, based on my experience and the research I've done, it has to do with personality. So, you were describing that very kind of tight, controlled personality. So, for mushrooms to work and for you to not have a really awful time on them, you have to release control. That's like an essential part of the healing process. I was always very open minded. I think actually one of the reasons I got so sick was because I was in the Canadian literary scene. It was very active and it was just hyper woke. And I was, I kept going off script. I kept looking into stuff that they told you not to look at and kept asking questions and kept getting almost canceled. I was never actually canceled, but a few people tried. And I think I just had this cognitive dissonance where I just knew something was wrong. Um, and anyways, I think the people who will have a really bad time on mushrooms are the people who need them most, really. So it's people with personality disorders and who have control issues, who are very rigid. And one of the reasons for that is the inability to release control. And if you're fighting the mushrooms, it can go very poorly for you. They're physically safe, but psychologically, it can be really hard. And the other reason is if you do a really big trip, it's like, for lack of a better description, it's sort of like going through, the story, A Christmas Carol. It's sort of like being visited by the spirits, and you go through your past, present, and potential future, and you see yourself more objectively. And I think for some people that can go, it's a wonderful life, and for other people it can go more Ebenezer Scrooge. And I think if you get Scrooged, it can be really hard on you psychologically. I've talked to a few people who did a big dose of mushrooms when they were young and were basically told that they were assholes. It's like playing Am I the Asshole with God? And if God says yes, I think it's hard to hear. So I actually don't recommend mushrooms for people under the age of 25 because I think doing it while your brain is still developing and while your ego is still sensitive is much riskier than doing it as an adult with a bit more maturity. So that's kind of one caveat. And it's hard because I think, like, when I first did mushrooms, I was, kind of crazy. I was just like, oh my God, this can heal the world. Everyone needs to do them. And I realized, and I still believe this, that taking mushrooms and listening to their advice would protect you from COVID, but also treat symptoms of long COVID and, like lingering brain inflammation and stuff. And, I started believing that in 2020 and pitched articles to publications, and everyone was like, hell no, we're not publishing that. And then around 2022, case studies started coming out of people saying, like, I had long COVID, I did a bunch of mushrooms, and now I'm fine. And I kind of expected the story to take off, and it never did. And I realized it's because the people who are most prone to getting long COVID and to getting chronic illnesses in general are the kinds of people you were describing, people who have that perfectionism, who have that tightness, who, you know, yeah, have maybe a bit of a devouring mother personality, and they are the people who probably need to be helped the most, but they can't really be helped by it because they'll probably have a bad time, or they'll just never try it because they're not willing to. It's too scary.
Yeah, I was reading that article, and you were talking about Germanic or Northern European cultures, and I that's something that I've always made a connection in terms of the stomach illnesses
Oh
and
yeah.
kind of authoritarian personalities. That I guess is anecdotal. Um, but yeah, because I don't know enough of the medical research to map all those things. But I do believe Crohn's disease tends to be Northern European originated. Um, you
I don't
know,
fully understand it. I just have noticed the pattern, and I've been trying to dig into the history of the Germanic peoples because I'm a bit like, what's going on? Like something insane happened here. Um, but as the farthest back I've been able to really figure out anything, and it has to go back further than this, is with the parenting books that came out of what is now like modern day Germany. It was then the Holy Roman Empire. And what Alice Miller, who was a Jewish psychologist, called poisonous pedagogies, or toxic ideas about child rearing, that she argued led Western and Northern Europeans and their descendants in the colonies to have a more totalitarian or narcissistic personality, and more autistic personality. So, like in the extreme, it was like advice like don't hug your children. Like, one of the best selling parenting book authors in the 1800s in what is now Germany was actually telling people not to hug their children, not to cuddle their children. And because of this guy, Dr. Moritz Schreiber, I'm not sure how to pronounce it, um, multiple generations of German kids grew up without being hugged. And then Nazi Germany happened. And meanwhile, this doctor who wrote these books, he had 3 kids. All 3 were diagnosed with mental illness. One committed suicide, and one became like a famous case study for schizophrenia and gender dysphoria. So um, basically, this sort of, I mean, I think intuitively can understand why emotionally neglecting your kids is going to fuck them up. Sorry if I swore, screw them up psychologically. Um, but at like a neurological level, the right hemisphere of the brain is dominant and rapidly growing for the first 3-4 years of life, and early neglect, especially in those first 3 years. And there's just a lot of common parenting practices that people don't really think of as neglect because they're so popularized and mainstreamed, such as leaving your baby to cry it out to sleep train them. People don't really think about what that's doing in terms of and each child's different, obviously, but what it can be doing in terms of stress and brain development, or things like in the US, there's no maternity leave. So some moms are going back to work after whatever it is, like 2 or 3 months. The kids are put in full-time daycare, and what that attachment, the problems that can come from attachment and brain development, because babies need a lot of one-on-one attention. And even in the best daycare scenario, they're not going to get that. It's impossible for the workers to give that to a baby, even in the best case scenario. And when the right hemisphere doesn't develop properly, what seems to result from that, so that I draw a lot on Dr. Ian McGilchrist's work. And what he's noticed is that in the West, we seem to have, generally speaking, people seem to have become more left hemisphere dominant and sort of disconnected from the right hemisphere's way of viewing the world. So it's like we have dysfunctional right hemispheres. And right hemisphere dysfunction and left hemisphere dominance is associated with, according to McGilchrist, with autism, schizophrenia, body dysmorphias, things like multiple personality disorder, to the extent that people listening think that's a real thing, eating disorders, anxiety disorders. So a lot of these conditions that we're seeing increase and get popularized on like social media. And kind of the other part of that, and why I think it really took off as smartphones and the internet became bigger things, is the left reading and writing lateralized to the left hemisphere, whereas nonverbal communication is lateralizes to the right hemisphere. So when young people are communicating via text message all day instead of hanging out in person, their strength, cells that fire together, wire together, kind of thing, right? Or neurons, whatever. So they're strengthening they're strengthening the left hemisphere and they're neglecting the right hemisphere in their communication. And in reading and writing is like an inherently autistic way of communicating. One of the symptoms or traits of autism is an impaired ability to understand nonverbal cues, like tone of voice, facial expressions, body language. So when you're communicating via text message, or you're talking to someone on Reddit or Instagram or Twitter or whatever, you're not getting that information. You're just getting the words back and forth. And I think to a lesser extent, communicating via like sharing photos and videos, which are, because they're recorded. I have an essay where I describe the famous physics experiment where light acts like a wave until it's recorded and then it collapses and it's a particle. So when we communicate in person, face to face, we're getting all this information that's not available through recorded transactions of information. And we feed off in real time off each other's information and we communicate like waves. But if I'm recording a video of myself and uploading it, and you're writing a comment and response, and then I write a comment and response, we're creating particles of ourselves and we're exchanging particles. And I think when we communicate via particles, we become more particle-like, more static, more inflexible, more autistic, and more narcissistic, more self-aware of being recorded. So it's, kind of like the observer effect, right? Where it's just harder to be natural and it's harder to evolve. So we become kind of static, if that metaphor makes sense.
You were talking about autism, and or excuse me, not autism, narcissism, and you have
Yeah.
a few articles where you talk about narcissism, and I struggled to understand what you were saying, because oftentimes my picture of a narcissist is of a sadistic person, somebody who likes to hurt other people.
Yeah, that's not
and
accurate.
and
That's not the typical.
yeah, when you said hyper self-aware,
Mm-hmm.
that changed the image of who I'm thinking about as narcissistic. And yeah, I suppose some of the stuff that you're bringing up about the history, cultural history, I have, and again, like, I actually think I mentioned this before we started recording about being a little bit suspect about how I was raised as a child in terms of this kind of wave-like interaction that you're talking about. Being and I have trouble with these diagnoses. One of the reasons I have trouble with them is I feel like there's a comorbidity with narcissism and with hypochondria, where
Mm-hmm.
people, they are so desperate for an analytical, categorical, particle sense of identity that they're like, I will not be whole until a doctor has put a rubber
Yeah.
stamp on my forehead saying I am autistic. And so when I know people in my family who've sought out these, and actually I was pressured, I was diagnosed with Asperger's, and it was something at the time which was I interpreted it as meaning I'm dumb or I'm defective or something. and
That's not what it means.
I had a very negative interpretation. I mean, it took a hit to my self esteem. Um, and people can, I guess, judge for where. I mean, I enjoy writing and reading and
Yeah.
stuff. So I think one of the ways of viewing it, well, okay, one of the things that people like to say on the left is gender is a spectrum, and I think there's some truth to that. And I think when we're talking about some of these qualities, communication styles, ways of seeing the world, ways of perceiving, interacting, I think that there's all sorts of crossovers with gender. And the problem is that as much as I want to give the left credit for gender as a spectrum, I also get these people, if I say like, oh, well, women are like this, men are like this, there's always that person who says, oh, no, they aren't. You can't make those kind of statements. And it really inhibits a free-flowing conversation where really we're referring to archetypes more than we're referring to individuals. And I spoke with an author recently, and he has this term, psychofauna, and what he means by that, it's sort of similar to the concept of an archetype, a Jungian, like the Jungian collective unconscious or something. But the idea is that you're imagining an egregore, you're imagining like an animal, and you're having an encounter with this animal. And this is really a sort of neutralized, a sort of morally neutral way of describing what in Christianity people would just call angels and demons. Instead of ascribing some kind of good or evil to them, you're just sort of neutrally all placing them in one category, saying it's psychofauna. It's these entities people can interact with, they can feed into them, they can receive power from them, they can give power over to them. And there, for instance, he used the example of national identity. So national identity is like this big beast that people can sort of feed energy into, and they can also harness the energy of that beast and use it to electrify people and mobilize people, get people out to the polls and so on, or go to war. So yeah, he has that idea, and I think that it's important that we're able to talk about archetypes or psychophon or whatever, male versus female, in these kind of idealized forms, while acknowledging that each person is an individual. And the idea that like I guess I believe that all of these quote unquote mental illnesses or mental diseases are spectrums, and that they are all strategic in the sense that they are purposeful and they are advantageous within certain environments, or at least if they are not advantageous, they are somehow clustered to in a hereditary sense, like schizophrenia, for example. And we talk like sickle cell anemia is a classic case where you have a set of genes, and because of how they express dominant or recessive, in some people they'll be helpful, in other people they'll be hurtful, but overall for the entire population it's a benefit. So even though you say, well, I don't see how schizophrenia is helping this individual person, but you have to understand that those genes are moving through a population and a family where the good outweighs the bad on a communal level, rather than just looking at an individual and saying like, oh, that there's no reason for this. This is a disease. This is an accident, like COVID. Like, we don't actually need COVID. We don't need the flu. We don't need viruses or diseases. Whereas we actually do kind of need left brain thinking, right brain thinking. We need these different perspectives. We actually need to be psychologically different from each other. If we were all sort of psychologically uniform and perfectly normal, we'd probably be much worse off, because there's a lot of things that we wouldn't perceive. So you have an article about this, the androgynous mind, that kind of gets at this like degendering or drive toward neutrality that we kind of have to. My interpretation of it, and I want you to expand on this, is that we're identifying maybe negative tendencies of hypermasculinity or hyperfemininity, but we're only seeing the negative tendencies, and we're not taking it together as a basket and saying or seeing how if you only look at the negative side and you say, well, it's kind of like saying if your hand is trapped under a heavy object and someone says, well, you can either cut off your fingers and escape, or you can leave them on and stay to die, and someone says, well, I'm a moderate, I'll cut off half my fingers, and it's like, you haven't solved the problem, right? So sometimes people want to run to the center, they want to be moderate, they want to be a centrist, and there's this safetyism that says, like, well, if we eliminate both kind of the hyper masculine elements of society, but we also eliminate these hyper feminine, we don't call them hyper feminine, but we sort of systematically suppress, oh, don't be emotional, don't be hysterical, don't be these things that we might not explicitly identify as feminine, but there's an association there. By pushing everybody into the middle, into this conformism where you're not allowed to express kind of those extremes of human nature, it doesn't eliminate them, it just represses them. And then it creates maybe that tightness that we're talking about. So kind of riffing off of that, can you kind of explain what's going on with the alphabet, the androgynous mind, literacy, and misogyny? And Miss Andrea as well.
Yeah. First of all, just regarding the DSM and the various diagnoses being spectrums, I agree with you. And I actually have an essay where I propose throwing out all those diagnoses and instead using the concept of broken mirror syndrome because there's so many comorbidities between all of these different conditions. And then looking at a lot of these disorders as disorders of broken mirroring. So failure to mirror and interact and have a healthy connection with other people, with your own body, with nature, with food, etc. Regarding the androgynous mind, so in that essay, I'm riffing off a theory by Dr. Leonard Schlein. I hope I'm saying his name correctly. And his argument in his book, The Alphabet versus the Goddess, is that literacy, because again, reading and writing lateralized to the left hemisphere, as cultures become more literate and as certain individuals become more hyperliterate and spend a lot of their time reading and writing, it results in a shift towards the left hemisphere and a shift away from the right hemisphere's way of interacting with and viewing the world and understanding the world. And what Leonard Schlein argues, and this is where I disagreed with him, is that the left hemisphere is masculine and the right hemisphere is feminine. But when you actually read his book, he argues, for example, that when ancient Greece became hyperliterate, men started becoming more homosexual. And I'm like, okay, so you're arguing that literacy masculinized men into homosexuality? That doesn't, he talks about like the ancient Hebrews and says that they, as they developed alphabet literacy, they got obsessed with books and started romanticizing the idea of Sophia or knowledge instead of actual woman. And I'm like, again, that doesn't sound super masculine to me. That sounds androgynous and maybe a bit more asexual. So what I argue in that essay is that the left hemisphere is actually more androgynous. And I think this lines up a bit more with Ian McGilchrist's theory of the hemispheres in The Master and His Emissary. He doesn't argue that, but I think it aligns with his theory. Whereas sex differences or masculinity and femininity lateralize to the right hemisphere. So a part of that is that the right hemisphere processes our connection to our bodies, whereas the left hemisphere is more disembodied and more autistic, more abstract, and thinks in black and white and is more mechanistic and bottom up. Whereas the right hemisphere is more holistic and processes our connection to spirituality, to nature, and is really like the part of our brain that, again, this is all grossly oversimplified. Both hemispheres are involved with everything we do, but the right hemisphere is like more involved with like authentic human connection between us and other people. So what I'm arguing in that essay is that the shift towards the left hemisphere that's been observed by Ian McGilchrist and was observed by Leonard Schlein, and it seems to have resonated with a lot of readers of both of those books, is actually making us more androgynous, at least cognitively, although I think there's some evidence that there's more physical androgyny happening too. And in particular, a subtype of androgyny that is referred to as negative or undifferentiated androgyny. So that's low masculinity and low femininity, as opposed to positive androgyny, which would still be very right hemisphere oriented because that's high masculinity and high femininity. So that's someone who's androgynous but has a lot of healthy masculinity or healthy masculine traits and a lot of healthy feminine traits. Whereas someone who's negatively or undifferentiated androgynous is a bit more like childlike and neotenous and is lacking in healthy masculinity and femininity. And that's the kind that appears to be more associated with autism and mental health issues, and I believe with early childhood neglect, with poor nutrition, toxin exposures, and other things that disrupt brain development and hormonal health, and just general. You can't separate our brain from the rest of our body, especially our gut. So even things like a vitamin D deficiency from not going outside as much as we used to, or people wearing sunscreen 24/7 is going to throw off so many parts, like so many systems. It's going to throw off your sleep. It's going to throw off your hormone health. It's going to throw off your serotonin. Um, it's everything. Everything's just so connected that you like poke at like one thing and it's going to be connected to like eight other, so many other things. But so that's loosely the theory of the androgynous mind. So that's what I'm observing is I think, and I guess one of the arguments in that is that people who are hyperliterate, and I think people can observe this, and it makes sense intuitively. So like academics, journalists, philosophers, less so creative writers, because imagination is very much right hemisphere, and to write a really good book or poem, you kind of need to be in touch with that intuitive side of the brain. But memoirists, people, writing about their own personal experience, not using their imagination, they're writing, are often very left hemisphere dominant and more androgynous. And I think, Leonard Shlain talks about how after each surge in literacy, there was waves of misogyny, like the witch hunts followed the printing press kind of thing. And he gives multiple examples that I talk about briefly in the essay. And what I'm arguing or adding to that is that I think that the shift towards the left hemisphere also increases misandry or hatred of masculinity. It's both. So the feminist movement is largely a product of like the skyrocketing literacy rates among women that started happening in the 1800s, 1900s, and women got addicted to reading and became academics. Not all women, obviously, but the feminists, were exchanging books and pamphlets and stuff, and they, people argue that they hate masculinity, they hate men, but they also seem to hate femininity. And I gave again some examples of the feminine side, the nurturing, healthy maternal side, being rejected too by some of feminists throughout history.
That is fascinating. I wasn't convinced. I was like, psychedelics, not for me. I started listening, and I was, I'm reading along with these articles, and it just, to me, it's like a grand unified field theory of politics, personality, psychology. Okay, maybe I'm going overboard, but really, I guess I've met people. So you mentioned like vitamin D, and it's like I've met these people, and to me, it's almost like when you have a disease and the disease hijacks your brain to protect itself from getting treatment. So, like animals with rabies become hydrophobic or something. Like there's this sense in which it seems like people are seeking homeostasis, even if it's a broken homeostasis. And so if you threaten that, like, I don't know any people who have, who struggle with autism spectrum, or like I'm saying, there are people who are on the autism spectrum who are even if they would not be classified as highly functioning, like they're kind of comfortable in their own mind, in their own skin. You can tell that they're autistic, but they're enjoying life to the fullest or something. People who are really struggling, where I've never seen one of these people get really tan. People with gender dysphoria, I've never seen them very tan. And, I've heard about the benefits of tanning. I've done a little tanning here and then when the sun is out. But, and so, I've heard a little bits and pieces, but I really am starting to think like, okay, we have to ban women from reading. Just kidding. We're not going to do that. But we have to make people take psychedelics, and we have to make people tan. If somebody says, "Hey, I feel like I was born in the wrong body," it's like, okay, we're taking a trip down south. You're going to get a tan, and we're going to see how you feel then. And I think to the dietary point, right? Here's another thing. Vitamin D, where's the plant source of vitamin D?
Mushrooms.
There's animal sources, but where's the plant source? And so you've got
mushrooms with vitamin D.
Well, here's the problem with the mushrooms. To get the vitamin D, they actually need exposure to the sun, and a lot of the store-bought mushrooms don't get it. Right. So here's the like stack of, this is like the evil giant whopper of maladies, where you've got, puts on all the sunscreen, doesn't get sunlight, is a vegetarian, isn't getting vitamin D from the diet, is replacing, instead of having fish oils, is having vegetable oils, canola oils, seed oils, and has gender dysphoria, has some autism spectrum disorder, is that kind of narcissism of self-obsession, self-diagnosis, hypochondria, hyperliterate, like all of these things. And I'm sure there's pieces I'm missing here, but it's like a perfect storm. And then you've got an eating disorder, and you've got an eating disorder that comes with the onset of puberty, which we typically say, oh, well, this is young girls who are exposed to social media. They're not confident about their bodies, so they're starving themselves because of these social pressures. But from a biological standpoint, could it be that the onset of pubertal hormones are producing a psychological defense mechanism where this kind of, you're talking about this misogynist, misandrist, internalized psychology that says puberty's a threat because it's taking me away from my androgynous childhood and it's bringing me into masculine and feminine qualities. And so in order to stop this, in order to delay puberty, you starve yourself. You starve yourself as an attempt to maintain the androgynous psychology. And, so it's like it's almost like people are demonically possessed and the demon is trying to prevent an exorcism. It's trying to protect itself. It's trying, Eckhart Tolle is not so much into the health and biology. He's very focused on psychology, spirituality, but he has this concept of the pain body. And he says, you should think of the pain body as a creature, as a psychofauna, you could call it. It wants to survive and it's hungry and it wants to eat. So it's going to bother you and it's going to ask for food. And you can feed it by focusing on the negative and ruminating and criticizing yourself. And you can feed this pain body. It gets bigger and bigger. It gets hungrier and hungrier. And I'm just kind of taking that concept, moving it over to a more, biologically intersecting idea of there is this kind of misandrist, misogynistic entity that exists as like an archetype within the mind that has this sort of web of interconnected comorbidities of behavior of, I'm afraid to get a sunburn because sunburns cause cancer, even though cancer rates have increased with sunscreen usage. And, I'm afraid to eat meat. I have to be a vegetarian. And maybe there's spiritual reasons for it, but this hyper-controlling personality, type A, everything has to be exactly right at all the categories. I mean, I feel like I want to like form a mantra here and like really internalize this thing because I've just met these people. And I think even again, it's all a spectrum. So there are people who are kind of off the charts, off the scale, but I think everybody to some extent, I mean, who wasn't as a kid lathered up in sunscreen? Who wasn't as a kid, all these different, if you're Amish or something, you're the exception. But, it's like a majority of people, yeah, who didn't grow up with some fast food or some seed oils or whatever. So we've all been exposed at least to literate. I mean, we are, presumably we all can read. We're on Substack, right? So we've been exposed to hyperliterate culture, and so we're all kind of like out of balance, and it's just something that I feel like I had the cloudiest awareness of it, but it wasn't until now that I'm kind of bringing it together and saying, like, it would be wonderful if there was a word that could describe all these interconnected phenomenon and bring it together. And I don't know if you have a suggestion or somebody else has come up with something, but that's definitely going to be on my list of things to do, is come up with a term with, I don't know if it would be you've said the androgynous mind. So maybe I feel like, again, coming from a left-wing orientation, saying you have androgynous personality disorder or something of that type
No.
is going to be taken as an attack on people who are like David Bowie. But actually, I've seen this before, that there's a
No.
difference between being androgynous because you have suppressed femininity and suppressed masculinity, and being androgynous because you're like this flamboyant homosexual or bisexual or something, and you express both of those. So anyway, I've been going off. I wanna let you respond.
So the two terms I've proposed to kind of like address the cluster of traits, because you're completely right, and you're right to bring vegetarianism into it, but especially veganism. Like if you're not eating eggs, you're just screwed, right? Not eating eggs and meat, or like good quality dairy products. But I've been using broken mirror syndrome as like the cluster diagnosis, because it's a disconnect. We have the mirror neurons in our brain, and we're supposed to be mirroring and in our interactions with other people, and again, like with nature and with spirit or God, or however you want to conceptualize spirituality, however you want to conceptualize that. And what I think people have are, the mirror system is broken. Their mirroring is broken, so they're self-absorbed. They're they're more isolated mentally and cognitively and physically, and they're disconnected. And it seems to feed upon itself. And then the other term I used was the psychosomatic hell spiral, which is like, as you become physically ill, you're more likely to isolate. And as you become more likely to isolate, you're more likely to have worse mental health. And as you have worse mental health, you're more likely to eat worse and not take care of yourself. And so you get more physically ill. And it's just, a hell spiral. That's one of the reasons I suggest psychedelics, is that it's really hard to break out of. And I think one of the only ways to do that is to kind of hit it in multiple axes at like the same time. And I think mushrooms can heal the mind and heal the body at the same time. And if you're doing them in a safe setting, can also heal that connection to other people, which is why I think it's important not to do them alone, which I have done, but don't recommend. I'm reckless. But sorry, what was I going to say?
I want to
Okay, there you go.
I'll say, I really feel like, for me, thinking of narcissism, I want to maybe meet in the middle here, or cross pollinate broken mirror narcissism, because we have this term narcissism. It has I have a misapprehension about it. A lot of people have a misapprehension, and there's vulnerable narcissism, and I think broken mirror narcissism, or something to get at the idea that this is ultimately a desire for control. That when people go on a vegan diet and they put on the sunscreen and they eat food that they know is bad for them, but they eat it as a kind of self-comforting mechanism, it's all about driving out those masculine, feminine, creative, kind of exploratory urges that, can be it can be upsetting if you want to have control over your emotions, to feel masculinity and femininity, because those are emotional states. When you feel very masculine, you feel very feminine, that's emotional. And if you've kind of been trained psychologically through hyperliteracy to believe that emotion is bad and that you're a bad person for feeling emotional and a good person is stoic and a good person doesn't feel emotions, and that's
Like
what,
for lots of Dr. Spock or whatever, Spock.
yeah, you're supposed to be a robot. You're supposed to be, and sometimes I think in religious depictions of, and there's nuances in this, and I don't want to paint religion with too broad a brush, but there are certain depictions of the Buddha or Christ as emotionless, that they don't, I mean, that's depending on the tradition you're looking at. But definitely, I think both of those traditions have some kind of relationship with Stoicism. And Stoicism, there is this idea, the Greeks had this idea of, you need to control your emotions and you need to. So that ethic of saying emotions are morally wrong, you've got to control your emotions, that moralism, that kind of is the crown of the narcissistic broken mirror complex, is I have to be a good person, and I'm hyper fixated on my self-perception of my own moral status, independent of logic, reason, common sense, whatever. And so whatever I need to do to accomplish that, I'm going to do that. And that's why you get this hyper-fixation on, now I don't want to say fringe issues because probably we're considered to be talking about fringe issues right now, but I mean fringe issues in the sense of these are sort of totemistic idols that people pick out as this is the most important thing in the world, when, like, it's, as you said, entirely disembodied, entirely abstract. We believe in the land back movement where we're going to return all the land to the Native Americans. Okay, that is it. That is like so disconnected from the reality that we live in on a day-to-day basis, and yet people will sort of hyperfixate on that, and they express that pent-up rage and the repression of emotions through that political ideology. And then you say, whoa, this person is crazy. They're screaming at me about some obscure political issue. Do they really think this is going to convince me? No, they don't. They are just expressing pent-up emotions. That is the healthiest way that they have to express those emotions as a human necessity. Of course, it's toxic and there's a better way and stuff. But so I would love to, I'd love to develop, I'm not a graphic designer artist, but I would love to encourage graphic designers, artists, people who are creative, who love visualization, to help develop imagery and art and poetry that expresses and identifies and helps us intuitively integrate, this cluster, and to be able to identify it in others, to identify it in ourselves, so that we're not sort of unconsciously sleepwalking our ways into our own mental prisons, but we can be liberated from this. We can step outside of this, and there's a bigger fullness of life out there to be experienced. And so, like, seeing some of those traits in myself, seeing some of those traits in others, it's like an opportunity. This is not an unsolved problem. You don't just assume that you're born defective, or capitalism made you this way, or the world's just an evil place, or whatever. It's like there are very simple but creative solutions. Some of those could be drugs. Some of that could be getting a tan. Some of it's exercise. Some of it's, getting rid of the polyester, getting off the seed oils, ditch the veganism, eat some eggs. This is, and stop worrying about yourself, your own moral status, and start focusing on expressing rather than repressing your masculine, your feminine emotional states. Embrace it, integrate it as part of yourself. Jungian, shadow work, psychoanalysis. It's all there. It's all together. So I don't know. We've already gone an hour. Obviously, I want to give you plenty of time here to finish up and wrap up. I'm sure we could go longer and cover a whole host of other issues, but I think we actually covered a lot of ground here, so I'm pretty excited. But I'll give you the floor to respond.
All right. I think the kind of the last thing, this just ties into what you were saying, the long list of conditions or traits or whatever that seem to be like very comorbid with each other. There's gut microbiome disturbances. So I think, when we're colonized basically by unhealthy gut bacteria, those gut bacteria crave things that are unhealthy for us. Like they feed off like sugar, or they'll crave seed oils, etc. But they also create inflammatory responses in the body that make you fear the sun, because you're more likely to sunburn if you're eating lots of seed oils. And you have certain nutrient deficiencies that are inevitable if you're eating processed food all the time and you're not eating meat or eggs and stuff like that. The other part of it is that certain B vitamin deficiencies are linked to decreased appetite. So in this like weird, and B vitamins are we mostly get them through animal sources disproportionately. There's some plant sources, but it's just easier if you just eat like beef liver or something to get all your B vitamins. And when we have a B vitamin deficiency, or when we have, I can't remember which ones, it's like B1 and I can't remember which ones. There's certain specific ones, B1, B9, folate, that cause decreased appetite when you're deficient in them. So your body, it's like you're deficient in nutrients, but then you also want to starve yourself and eat more junk food and processed food. And I have another essay on my Substack. It's called Down the Folic Acid Rabbit Hole, that talks about how synthetic vitamins might actually be contributing to the autism, gender dysphoria, fearing the sun, this kind of spectrum of traits. Because when we're consuming synthetic vitamins, which are largely derived from petroleum byproducts, our body doesn't process them the same way that they do natural vitamins from food. And so things like prenatal vitamins and multivitamins and fortified and enriched foods, highly processed foods that have synthetic vitamins added to them, might be like fucking up our, I keep swearing, I'm sorry, screwing up our brain and our gut microbiome in a way that impairs appetite, that leads to disordered eating, that leads to, there was like a study with rats where they were given junk food for a bit, and then when they were given normal healthy food, they just didn't eat it. They just would rather starve than eat the healthy food. So that's, very clearly like avoidant restrictive food intake disorder that's associated with autism, where these people, these kids largely, which basically just rather starve themselves and eat healthy food, but they'll eat chicken nuggets and they'll eat goldfish crackers, which are just processed junk filled with like fake folic acid. So it's very complex. And in that essay, I actually interview a doctor, a general practitioner who specializes in LGBTQ plus medicine. So he sees a lot of transgender patients. And his theory is that folic acid, which the prenatal vitamins with folic acid started being introduced in the late 70s and became really much more popular and considered necessary for pregnant women during the 80s. And then folic acid was added to like basically all grain products in North America and to other like fortified and enriched foods in the late 90s. Basically, he's arguing that folic acid exposure during pregnancy and early childhood causes all these disruptions that increase the risk of autism in the children, but also of certain cancers, including like lung cancer and breast cancer and colon cancer, and of things like tongue ties in children, which can then prevent the child from breastfeeding, which then causes a bunch of problems, obviously, allergies, asthma, and gender dysphoria. And he explains it. It's like an 8,000 word essay, but I think it's part of again, what I was saying about like broken mirroring narcissism, which I actually agree is appropriate, because when you pull out and you use narcissism the way it was originally described by like people like Freud and Alice Miller, it's a very accurate description of it. The reason I didn't go with that was actually because I think the term narcissism carries too much stigma now and it's misunderstood. And I was trying to come up with something that was less, stigmatized and more neutral, because I think people who have broken mirror syndrome, or who are what I say is in a state of narcissism, are not bad people necessarily. They're in a lot of pain, and you're more likely to focus on yourself when you're in pain. And it's a natural way of protecting yourself. But I think kind of something I'm trying to say in a roundabout way is I think it's really important for people to heal their gut and heal their connection to nature, which includes getting out in the sun. But in order to safely get out in the sun without sunscreen, you need to eat healthy, otherwise, you will burn. And things like SSRIs will also make you more likely to sunburn. So, it's really, really difficult to get healthy. Kind of what I'm saying.
I'm going to go in the opposite direction of you. So we don't want to stigmatize this. I say we're going to call it vampire syndrome because they're afraid of the
Oh,
sun, and
I've done that too.
they want to, and they need the vitamins that are in the blood. So they desperately need blood. And they're probably afraid of garlic because garlic has some, nutrients in it or whatever. I don't know. That's just off the cuff, but yeah, fascinating discussion. Obviously, different. I mean, I haven't really done a deep dive into diet yet on Substack. I wrote a few drafts of oh, here's some diet advice or whatever, but this is like interdisciplinary. I mean, we got a little bit into history, we got into politics, we got into, and to see that like our individual psychologies, when you have the same symptoms for millions of people, it does scale sociologically. It does. The idea that there's this discrete, again, categorizing thinking that, oh, individual psychological problems are in this neat little box over here, and then big social civilizational problems, they're in this box over here, and never the two shall meet. Well, if only life were that simple, but it's not. And so, yeah, it really, I don't know, kind of opened my eyes today to talk about this. I really think this, what we're talking about here could be life-saving advice for a lot of people who, struggle with any of the symptoms that we're talking about, and maybe haven't noticed, maybe, oh, I noticed I have this issue and I didn't connect it to that, but now that I think about it, yeah, that's also a problem. Never seen the connection. Connecting those dots together, making the sense of the world, having a pattern, giving people back the power and control that they're seeking, but in a way that is, rather than self, cannibalizing and feeding the problem, getting out of the hole, and yeah, seeing some light in the distance, and like you said, we can use these various terms, and I want to imagine it like you said. There's an alien gut microbiome, and it's sending your neurons these false signals that you need junk food now because that's what it wants. That's what's good for it, but that's not what's good for you. So recognizing, yeah, it's kind of an evil entity, but you're not an evil entity. You just need an
Yeah.
exorcism, with some good tea and some diet, exercise, sunlight, all the good stuff. So, yeah, I think this could be very valuable for some people. Obviously, if they want the full picture and the full story, they gotta read what you're putting out. I wanted to ask you before we go, sort of what projects you're working on, what you're thinking about, what we can look forward to from you.
Well, I just had a baby, so I'm probably not going to be super prolific for a while. I am considering expanding the androgynous mind theory into a book, but that would take a while to do, obviously, because it's like 8,000 words, that essay, and honestly, there's just so much more there that I just couldn't go into. I am planning on eventually starting an essay about what I call my crunchy pregnancy, because so I just had my second child, and I kind of, with my first child, I just followed all the medical advice, and she was like a high risk pregnancy, and a bunch of stuff went wrong. I had all these complications. And with this time, I was like more prepared with all this research I'd been doing, and critical thinking, and podcast listening, and following people like RFK Jr. that people think are crazy. And I was like, okay, this time I'm not taking prenatal vitamins. I'm avoiding sugar like it's cocaine, basically, or like it's alcohol, maybe. Refined sugar, not all sugars. You eat fruit and stuff. Um, And I was like, I'm going to try to, instead of doing prenatals, I'm going to try to get all my nutrients from food sources. And I just had like a complication free pregnancy. It was just super healthy. I didn't have morning sickness. Like, and then the baby was super healthy. And I was like, all right, great. So that worked. So yeah, stuff like that. But kind of I want to circle back to something you said to end on. You mentioned what I was describing as broken mirror syndrome or narcissism as being like a vampire syndrome. So in the broken mirror, vampires were clearly a metaphor for the Germanic elites and aristocracy back in the day. So narcissistic, staying in their castles and not leaving and feeding on the blood of their people. It's not exactly, it's a pretty like on the point metaphor, but and indigenous people in some certain tribes, I can't remember which ones in North America, have like a similar concept, the Wendigo, which is basically this monster that is endlessly hungry and consumes other people. Um, so at the end of the Broken Mirror Syndrome essay, I actually talk about vampires and werewolves because, and I'm hoping that this conversation is an example of this, but I talked about how there's writers and artists and podcasters, communicators, or whatever, who are vampires. So when they put material out there, they're doing it to extract. They're trying to get money, they're trying to get fame. They're very conscious of how they're perceived. They're trying to seek a mirror that shows them the reflection they want to see of themselves. And um, so it's like seeking blood, basically, a metaphor when you're putting out art. It's very controlled. And the other type of artist or writer, podcaster, communicator, whatever, influencer, is the werewolf kind. And the werewolf is also damaged, is also a bit of a monster, has a monster that they're grappling with, but they're howling at the moon just to hear who howls back. They're looking for some sort of authentic connection. And I guess I aspire to be a werewolf on this platform. And um, that's about it. It's just howling.
Well, it's howling well received. Music to my ears. I really
Yes.
appreciated you coming on and spending time with me, kind of distilling a lot of these ideas. A lot of work goes into them. I'm feeling a little bit vampiric. I'm afraid that I'm going to put this podcast out and I'm going to have my rational secularists in my comments saying, I thought I didn't think you were a conspiracy theorist. You're going out with the RFKs, but you know what? I mean, ultimately, I don't know. We didn't even touch on some of the more controversial issues. So if people are scared of this, like, there's bigger fish to fry, I guess. So don't don't hate me, but it's an interesting perspective. Um, the idea that our medical establishment is doing everything right and everyone's diet is perfect and we're sorry, I'm skeptical of that, but anyway, people can take it or leave it. It's a variety show, so we've always got something new on. Meghan, appreciate you coming on. Hopefully you're going to be very busy here in the next few months, but at some point in the not too distant future, I hope we can speak again because you got a lot to offer. We got a lot more we can still cover for the future.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me on.
Absolutely. All right. Well, that's a wrap. And take care. Bye bye now.
Bye.
All right, guys. That was pretty cool. If you know any vampires, send them this video. I feel bad because I feel like I should have figured this stuff out a long time ago. It makes me want to take psychedelics right now. If anyone, okay, that's a joke. Drugs are illegal. I'm not going to solicit drugs. I'm not going to ask you to mail me drugs in the mail. But if you know a guy knows a guy, you just slide into my DMs. And yeah, it's interesting. It's an interesting concept. That was really I didn't expect to go through all of that, But we did in record time, 1 hour, 20 minutes. Jam-packed episode. If you liked it, give it a like. Feed me. I need your blood. Give me some restacks. Give me some comments. I need your money. I need your fame. But yeah, it's a good one. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.